This particular year is what we call a midterm or off-year election, meaning that there's not a presidential contest, and that tends to sort of depress electoral turnout. But it's nevertheless an important election, both within the state of North Carolina. We have a number of important judicial elections, including some for the state's highest court. And I think the one that everybody is keeping their eye on because of the national implications are what we call the midterm congressional races.
Midterms are very important because, especially this particular midterm on the federal level, in North Carolina, we have a Senate seat that is up, and when you look at what's going on the national level, we see that there's a lot of fight over control of the U.S. Senate, and North Carolina is receiving a lot of attention, not just here in the state, but nationally because of the stakes.
2014 is one of those years where the margins are close enough in the Senate. In the House of Representatives, it's pretty much a given that the Republicans will retain their majority, but particularly in the Senate, we have the possibility of either the Democrats hanging on to power for the last two of the president's years. The Republicans have a very good chance. In fact, many pollsters are suggesting that with the right kind of turnout in the right places, that they could take control of the Senate, and then they would control both chambers of Congress. Or we could have, sort of an interesting hybrid split again, where the margins are so close that whomever becomes the majority party in the Senate has to rely on the couple of independents that are in the Senate to form sort of a ruling coalition. And we haven't seen that kind of party politics in American legislative politics since pretty much very early on in the history of the Republic. So this is one of those key critical years.
A lot of issues that we think are actually settled by our legislature and our Congress are actually being dealt with by the courts. And so when we look at the North Carolina Supreme Court, we have 4 seats that are up for election on the North Carolina Supreme Court, and we have a number of seats on the North Carolina Courts of Appeal and other races. So the judges play an important role that a lot of people don't pay as much attention to as they should. An important issue that may be before some North Carolina judges may be support for vouchers, for private school education, for charter schools, the very contested and disputed new North Carolina voter law that brought the photo voter ID, limited the number of early voting days, cut out same-day registration as well as pre-registration for those who are getting ready to turn 18. And so that is still being contested. And I still don't think the issue of same-sex marriages is completely settled, because what could happen in another district is that courts in that particular area, not in the 4th, which is where North Carolina is, could support bans on same-sex marriage, and then that's something that may have to go to the Supreme Court, the National Supreme Court. So that's nothing that we vote on, but still the courts play an important role in issues like this.
Part of going back to what I said earlier about the importance of the midterm elections is magnified in North Carolina because 1/3 of the Senate is up for election every 2 years, as opposed to the entire House of Representatives, which comes up every 2 years for election. This could have been an important midterm election had North Carolina not had a Senate race up for grabs, but of course we do in the famous, or maybe I should at this point say the infamous race between incumbent Kay Hagan and her challenger Tom Tillis. Both parties have identified the North Carolina seat as a vulnerable one, which is the reason you see parties and third-party organizations who support both candidates spending really heavily on TV advertising here. The comment, all politics is local, is Tip O'Neill's, former Speaker of the House back in the 1980s. And it's really sort of gained worldwide acceptance. I've heard politicians at the United Nations and in other global contexts use it. And I think O'Neill was exactly right in saying that ultimately, but particularly with these legislative races, because the elections have national consequence, but they're held at the state level, voters in North Carolina will be making a critical choice not only for themselves, but for the rest of the country. Because the Hagan-Tillis race will be one of those key races, along with some in Kentucky and a few other states, where we think the balance of power is going to be decided. You know, if Hagan wins and Democrats pick up or hold on to another seat or two that are up in question, then it's very well possible that they will maintain their majority. If Hagan goes down and the Kentucky race goes to the incumbent there, Mitch McConnell, then the Republicans are going to have a very good night.
In this election cycle, people need to know that they do not have to have a photo ID in this particular election. That is not in effect until the 2016 election, but poll workers will be asking them for ID just to see if they have the appropriate ID to vote. Now, some people may interpret them being asked for the ID that they actually need the ID, and that is not the case. And some poll workers might not be as trained and as aware as they should be in terms of knowing that this is just a question to prepare people for 2016, and that voters do not need to have photo voter ID until 2016. So people need to know that is the case. If they have any problems, there is a nonpartisan toll-free number that they can call, 866-OUR-VOTE, if they have any problems at the polls.
Generally speaking, in presidential election years, we see about half of registered eligible voters turn out to vote. The last several elections, it's been higher than that. Sometimes it's, if you go back to the 70s and 80s, we see it just below 50%. But then we get a roll-off effect in midterm elections, and it's not uncommon for the average midterm election turnout to be something in the neighborhood of a third, or maybe slightly higher than a third, of eligible registered voters. And of course, there are two ways of looking at that as a political scientist. One is the sort of traditional view that I think has more weight to it, which is that, to put it very simply, you can't complain if you don't vote. If something happens, if the position or the party that you are not a member of somehow winds up taking power and doing things that you don't like, you're in an awfully bad position to go around complaining about it if you didn't do something to do your part to support your issues and your candidates and your party. The other position, however, is that low voting is a sign of stability in Western democracies. And basically the thinking goes that you see really high turnout, mostly in countries that have great crises on their hands, where the winning party or the winning candidate really does seem to be a matter of life and death for certain people or certain subgroups of the population. And so that school of thought says low turnout's not necessarily a bad thing. It just sort of shows that many Americans think that the stability of our democracy isn't shaken to the core regardless of who wins.
I had the opportunity to travel to South Africa this past summer, and I saw some video and still pictures of people who waited for days in order to cast a vote as a free South African. And here, voting is relatively convenient, and we don't take the opportunity to exercise that right to vote after people literally died and put everything on the line. Also, voting and what happens politically controls almost everything we do from the day that we're born to the day that we die. When you're born, you get a birth certificate. When you die, there's a death certificate. And everything in between, in terms of taxes, in terms of education, in terms of healthcare, in terms of housing, in terms of minimum wage, and other quality of life issues and other social issues affect us on a day-to-day basis. And so it's important for us to play a role in determining the people who would make those kinds of critical decisions.
If you look at the turnout levels in more recent midterm elections where the numbers have been going up, I think it's clear that as we continue with this period of gridlock and partisan rancor that in the modern day really hasn't been seen in Washington, certainly not in many, many decades. I believe that over time it's beginning to wear on a lot of American voters, and they're getting much more frustrated with their elected leadership in Washington, the idea that Congress doesn't seem to be able to do anything, or we have this sort of ongoing battle between the executive and legislative branches. And so we're actually beginning to see more stated or self-reported interest across demographic groups, across race lines, across age lines, across gender lines. That's one of the reasons that I think the 2014 election will see a higher turnout than we see in, if I want to characterize it this way, say a more sort of boring or routine midterm election. That may actually be a sign that more Americans are seeing their stability as being threatened, and so they feel compelled to go out and turn out to vote to change things. But by and large, you're absolutely right that the turnout statistics for midterm elections are not certainly not as good as American presidential elections. And if you look at turnout levels for all American national elections, they're one of the lowest percentage levels of Western democracies in the world.
North Carolina Central University itself has a strong history in the civil rights movement, to get the vote, to actually make sure we actually have a precinct on campus. In the 80s, there were marches to make sure the students had an opportunity to vote here on campus. And what we've tried to do with the Institute for Civic Engagement and Social Change is to sort of enhance what people are already doing. So in terms of voter registration, voter education, and getting people out to vote, we work with existing organizations to educate people, to get them registered, and to get them out to vote. Now, in presidential elections, we do real well. Since the 2000s, we've been in the 90% range in terms of voter turnout. It's in the midterm elections and the municipal elections where we don't do as well. Now, in the last midterm election, which was in 2010, that a lot of people point to as a time of relatively low turnout, North Carolina Central University did fairly well. We did around 60%, or 50% rather, I'm sorry, 50%. And as compared to other precincts here in Durham, for example, we did fairly well. Now in municipal elections, especially primaries, we don't do well at all. 5%, 6%, even low as 3%. So one of our aims is to make sure that we have as much turnout in midterm and municipal elections that we have in presidential elections.
Well, my message to students would pick up on something that I said a little bit earlier, and that is that it really is a privilege if you think about the history of the United States and all of the people who fought and died as American soldiers, or the people who are on the front lines of the civil rights movement who also fought and died in a way in the domestic context to fight for the right of people to be equal and to have the opportunity to vote. And so we've got this long history in the United States of taking the franchise very seriously, taking the right to vote as one of those sacrosanct rights of American citizenship. And I sort of wonder sometimes if you could bring people back like Martin Luther King or Alexander Hamilton or some of these other great figures of American history, and you could show them the results of turnout figures in modern elections and show them what's going on and say, this is the country that we've built based on the building blocks that you provided with us. And I sometimes sort of have these little conversations in my head about what they would say, and I don't think they would be particularly pleased about how we've sometimes put elections aside or under the table because we seem to be more worried about the latest iTunes releases on our portable devices, or the latest TV show, or it's raining and I can't go out to vote. I think voting takes a committed effort. People have to really change their mindset and adopt as a critical value of democracy that they need to participate. Their voice is important. They can convince themselves, I'm only one person, oh, the election is lost, I'm not going to go bother because my vote doesn't make a difference. We've seen in many, many occasions in the past in many elections where one or even a handful of votes can make a critical difference. And I don't need to point to anything more ancient than the 2000 presidential election in Florida to make my case for that. So I try to instill in my students this sense of history and understanding the significance of the people who sacrificed tremendously so that their generation as well as future generations would have that right to vote. And so I say, I don't care how students or other individuals vote. I respect their choices with respect to the attitudes they have or the parties they support or the candidates they support. But I think it's absolutely critical that they get out and vote on Election Day, even if it's an inconvenience, because it's a minor inconvenience given what many great Americans have done to protect their right to do it.
If we don't, then it means that we're not a part of the process. We have no right to complain. And I always challenge people, tell me something good that ever came from not voting.